This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. A lot of this season, a lot of our hopes for this Cleveland Browns defense is going to be reliant on this question. How do they make up for not having Myles Garrett on the team anymore? They traded Myles Garrett for Jared Verse, a first, a second, and a third. Right now, in year one of that deal, all they're getting back is Jared Verse. So in the meantime, we know that the Browns' plan is to use that first-round pick this year, to use that second-round pick next year, to use that third-round pick the year after to kind of fill in, as well as Jared Verse's development for what they are not going to have by not having Myles Garrett on the team. That's the plan for the long term. But for the short term, how do you try to maintain the same quality or similar quality of defense while taking out the defense's most important chess piece in Myles Garrett and replacing it with Jared Verse? That's the big question for the Browns defense, and that's the big question for today's position review. We're going to be looking at the defensive line room entirely, so edges and defensive tackles. There are some things to note with this room, some areas where there is some potential growth that can be identified, and there is some things that I think that are very bright for this team's future as far as this defensive line room goes. So that's what we're going to be reviewing. But before I get into that, I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 sports app. The app is really easy to use for player picks. Just pick more or less for a few player stats and lock in your lineup. That's it. Rather just pick teams. Well, PrizePicks has that now too. Just pick the winner, spread, or total in any game or fight. PrizePicks is available in most states, including California, Texas, and Florida. Plus, you can even follow me on the app at Quinn_C and tell my picks with one click and follow your friends too. Speaking of my picks, here they are. Myles Garrett over 15.75 sacks. 16's been his baseline the last few years. I'd be very surprised if he goes to LA and that number drops, given that he's going to see more passing attempts, given that LA's offense is better than what the Browns have been. Quincy Judkins, 924 yards. They had two really good picks for Quincy here, 6 touchdowns or 924 yards. I feel comfortable taking more on both, but 1,000 yards feels like a safer bet for Quincy. I think he's going to have a big year this year. Carson Schlesinger, 2.25 sacks. I'm saying more. Remember, Mike Rutenberg likes to blitz his linebackers a lot more than the previous defensive coordinator the Cleveland Browns had. Also, Carson Schlesinger is probably going to have to get involved as a sack producer to make up for the hole that they're going to have to make up for Myles Garrett. And then Shedeur Sanders starting more than 7.5 games. I think he'll be the starter, play about 8 games or more this year, but that's my picks for this season. Best of all, play your first $5 and get $150 in lineups if you win. Just use the promo code HMA when you sign up. Again, that's your first $5 and get $150 in lineups if you win when you use the promo code HMA. PrizePicks has switched up their offer. There's no better time to join, lock in, and win that first lineup. All right, so let's start at the top here, right? What's the starting defensive line for the Cleveland Browns? And it's going to be more than likely Jared Verse, Alex Wright at both the edge positions. It may flip depending on if they go and pull the trigger on bringing in Clowney. Clowney's a good player. I think Clowney could help them on the field in some aspects. I have my reservations about Clowney due to how he left the team the last time he was here. But if you want to know more about that, there's a video that I go in detail about that. So potentially Clowney, but more than likely we're looking at, well, from what we know, I guess is the best way to put it. We're looking at Alex Wright. We're looking at Jared Verse. We're looking at Mason Graham. And we're looking at Malik Collins. So those are the 4 guys right there that you're starting with. Let's start with probably the weakest link here is Alex Wright. I think 5.5 sacks last year. He's been a steady improver. It's interesting, right? Because the Clowney thing really makes me wonder where they think Alex Wright is on his development. because Clowney is not a name you would bring in to be like a fourth edge, right? If we're just trying to replace Cam Thomas from last year, I don't know if you bring in Clowney. Now, maybe part of them bringing in Clowney is like, hey, we're going to have a conversation and let them know up front, these are the expectations. You aren't going to start. We're going to try to get you this many pass rush reps, this, that, and the third. And the expectations are really clear to Jadeveon so that he can't pull what he did last time, even though I thought expectations were pretty clear the last time they had Jadeveon on the roster. Maybe that's something that they feel like can work in that rotation and still have Alex Wright at the top of it. It's only confusing because the Browns decided to pay Alex Wright, right? Like they gave him a contract not that long ago. Let me look at the contract that they gave him. So if you look at Alex Wright's money, he's making about $10 million a year, 3 years, $33 million. And then it's 21 in guaranteed money. So about 10 and a half, close to 11. That's a little bit more than what the Browns were paying Jadeveon in 2021 and 2022. So if you rise that salary with the rise of the cap, it gets to about 11, 12 million. So they gave Alex Wright like starter number two, clear number two starter money, right? The same clear number two starter money that they gave to Jadeveon Clowney when he was getting $9 million in 2021 and then $10 million in 2022. And if we look at Jadeveon's number from last year, it's about $3.4 million. He had like 8.5 sacks, so I expect that number to probably go up. We're probably talking about 5 to 6 million with incentives, or incentives going up to about 8 million. 5 to 6 base is probably what the market would look like for Jadeveon, depending on how many suitors there are for him. So the money, if you want to follow the money here with the edge room, would still dictate that they're committed to Alex Wright as the number two edge, but they're going to fit Jadeveon into that rotation. Now, how does Jadeveon react to being into that rotation, given that, the Browns gave him clear number two money last time he was here and he was upset with being the number two to Myles Garrett? Now you're asking him to be second, maybe even third fiddle to Alex Wright for less money. I don't know if that's a stew for a good situation for Jadeveon, knowing how he's reacted in the past to stuff. But that's how it would work on paper. And I think on paper it does make a lot of sense here. The big question is, what do you feel like you need to get out of Alex Wright for him to be worth the $11 million that you pay him? I think 8.5 to 9 sacks is about what you expect. High single digits from him. And the question is, how close do you think he is to that? I think that's an achievable number for Alex Wright. I don't know if it's a consistent number that he can hit. He hasn't really demonstrated that. Maybe his true value is closer to about $7 million than it is about 11 or 12. But that's really the opportunity that Alex has in front of him, right? He needs to go from 4, 5, 6 sacks a year to making that leap to high single digits, maybe even double digits. I think that would be a bonus. But if he can get to 8.5, 9, right? Like those numbers, I think you'll be happy with what you can get out of him. It's just curious to me that the Browns are bringing in Jadeveon, or at least thinking about it. But maybe we're misreading this and thinking that Jadeveon's going to be more of a factor if he gets brought in than what the Browns are planning for, right? Maybe if we're looking at the money, right, it goes Jared Verse, or at least investment, Jared Verse, and then Alex Wright, and then third on that totem pole would be Jadeveon, and maybe that's how the Browns plan on slipping Jadeveon into this instead of him replacing Alex Wright. But that story does make this review interesting. We'll see what ends up happening with it. And by the time this video releases, maybe the Browns have brought in Jadeveon into this room, which talent-wise is going to make the room better. The big question is Jadeveon past what went wrong last time? because I can't have Jadeveon in this room if he's not going to be able to be mature enough to accept that he's not going to be the number one option, right? Like that was the issue when Miles was here. He was mad that he wasn't the number one option, that the Browns are funneling everything towards Miles. That was the right football decision, in my opinion. Miles is a much better player than Jadeveon Clowney. He deserved to get more of that attention from the coaching staff. And that's going to happen again, right? You know, the money says that they're going to put more of a priority on Alex Wright than they're going to put on Jadeveon. The money and investment says that they're going to put much more attention on Jared Verse and him getting his numbers versus caring about whatever Jadeveon does here. So if he's at a place mentally where he can accept that, then he could be a good part to this room. But that's probably going to be the expectation for him, given that they're paying $10 million for Alex Wright and they're already invested heavily in Jared Verse. So those are the guys that are going to prioritize getting their numbers. You know, if Jadeveon's fine hanging out in the back doing that, then sure. I don't really think this is a good move for either the Browns or Jadeveon Clowney, you know, because I don't think Jadeveon's going to get his numbers here in Cleveland the way that he wants to get his numbers, and the way that he kind of needs to get his numbers to be able to stay in the league. So, like, from a Jadeveon Clowney standpoint, I don't think this is a good match for him. And then also from a Browns standpoint, it's like, yeah, Jadeveon can make you better, but is the goal to develop the young players on the roster, or is it to be a better football team this year, right? Like, I feel like there's a balance, obviously, that you have to have with that, but I don't know if a signing of Jadeveon strikes that right balance there. So that's the big question with this edge room. Are they going to add Jadeveon to it? I still think regardless of if they sign Jadeveon or not, given that they paid Alex Wright, they're going to still start Alex Wright, which, again, creates an interesting situation. The defensive tackle situation is interesting as well. You got Mason Graham, who I think, if we're talking about the single most person on this team who sacrificed the most to help Miles get to where Miles got to, that guy is Mason Graham. I think Jacques Césaire has counted at least 6 sacks that Mason Graham should have probably taken claim of, but relinquished to Miles in Miles's pursuit of that sack record, which, hey, look, shout out to Mason Graham for being selfless, right? That's the kind of selfless attitude, non-ego driven attitude that this team does need. So not really criticizing him for that. When I watch him, he plays consistent with what you would think is about a guy who should have had 8.5 sacks. So the theoretical production is there, right? But as Kenny Atkinson has learned, analytically winning doesn't mean the same thing as winning, right? And that's the big thing with Mason Graham. Can he turn what was a year of excellent tape and really giving a lot of people who watch that tape a lot to be excited about? Can he turn that into tangible evidence that he's actually as good as we think he's going to be? But yeah, he's the guy who sacrificed the most when Miles was here. The guy who probably benefited the most because Miles was here was probably Malik Collins. He got a lot of one-on-ones, a lot of easy kind of pass rush situations where he didn't really have to think much and just got to put his head down and do what he does best, right? Which is just go at the quarterback. And when Miles was there, that was the game plan. They're going to have a similar game plan, but it's probably not going to be as aggressive. Does that affect Malik Collins' ability to put up the same kind of numbers that he did last year? I think the other thing that you got to pay attention to with Malik Collins is Mike Hall is now healthy. And Mike Hall not being healthy gave Malik Collins even more of a role on this defense. And with Mike Hall healthy and those two guys having similar skill sets, how do the Browns really balance getting those guys on the field, given that they want to see more from Mike Hall this year? And as much as we want the Browns to win games, they do have to run the balance of how they win and who they win with matters, and they want to win with these young players, right? Not necessarily with the guys who are 30. So they're going to give guys like Mike Hall a lot of opportunity. I wonder if that comes at the cost of Malik Collins's snaps, which, again, creates a bit of an interesting dynamic. As far as Mason Graham goes in this defensive tackle room, I expect him to take the biggest leap. He is the guy that I think got slept on the most in this 2025 class. But if you really paid attention, he was playing some really good football for like 4 weeks before he broke his ribs. And once he came back from the bye week, he was playing top 5 defensive tackle level stuff, right? And he was doing that at such a young age, at a position where dominating at a young age is very uncommon. So that's very encouraging for me. I think Mason Graham is going to be a really, really good player for the Cleveland Browns. And I think this year we'll start to see him kind of take this defense under his own, because he's the 5th pick, right? He's the guy that the Browns have selected in a spiritual sense to take over this defense, right? Like Carson Schlesinger, he's going to be a part of that conversation. Obviously, he won Defensive Rookie of the Year, but Mason Graham is the big piece that they got, right? He's the guy that they've drafted the earliest on this defense, the guy that they've invested a lot into. He's the guy that they're saying, hey, if somebody takes over this defensive line, it's going to have to be Mason Graham. And I think he's going to be in a position to do so. And I think by the end of the year, we'll be talking about how much more improvement he showed from one year to the other. And I think a lot of the conversations we've had about Mason Graham, where people can't really see it, who aren't used to looking for it, they're going to be much easierly convinced, because he's going to start doing the stuff that more casual fans will be able to notice. If we're looking at key members of depth for this team, right, Aiden Huntington is going to be an interesting one. He was the favorite project of the last defensive coordinator who was here, Jim Schwartz, and Kevin Stefanski, who had him on the offensive side. New coaches all around. I wonder if that changes how he's viewed. But somebody who has showed a lot of promise and did play special teams last year. Again, the coaching staff last year loved them, but all those guys are gone, right? Isaiah McGuire is another interesting one. I thought he's had a real good last couple of years, really showing himself as a run defender. I like what they have going on there at that right side between McGuire and Alex Wright. Maybe you can add a little bit more punch to that, but it seems like a fine enough rotation there. I'm not upset at it. Then you have that 4th guy. We talked about Jadeveon Clowney potentially factoring into that conversation as a 3rd or 4th edge here. If he's willing to accept that role and everything that it means. And in defensive tackles, you have the usual suspects, right, in the back. We talked about Mike Hall. We need to see more from Mike Hall this year. This is a big prove-it year for Mike, given that this is the first year where there's really no excuse, right? He's going to have a healthy camp, hopefully. He's going to go into the season not disrupted, right? Like being able to just roll in. That's what we need to see from Mike Hall. Really just no excuses. Need to see him show something. Sam Kamara, we know, is a great hand to have back there as like your last tackle on the roster. The big questions for this defensive tackle room don't really exist at the bottom of it. The bottom is fine. It's at the top, right? And that brings us to the biggest question with the Browns defensive tackle room, Jared Verse. What does Jared Verse need to do this year to have a good season, right? Like, let's just take everything else out of it. What does Jared Verse need to do to have a successful season? I don't think pressures alone are going to be enough for Jared Verse, right? Pressures have been enough for Jared Verse the last couple of years because he's been on good teams and they've been able to have success to a certain point to where you're not looking at the lack of conversion from pressure to sack as a big deal. Now that he's coming to Cleveland and the job is going to be a lot different, it's not enough to be top 5 in pressures if you're Jared Verse, right? You're going to have to convert these pressures into sacks. You're going to have to become a play finisher for this team. Like single-digit sacks is just not going to be acceptable for him. he's going to have a career high this year, and it's probably going to have to be, within 12? I think 12 is the bar for him. He should at least have 12 sacks, right? If Jared Verse is who the Browns hope that Jared Verse is going to be, which is, a potential top 5 edge, you got to at least get 12 to be a part of that conversation, right? So 12 sacks for Jared Verse is what I think the bar should be. I get it. He gets more pressures than he gets sacks. Everybody does, but he needs to convert those pressures into sacks. Like, that does matter. That part of it does need to matter. And that's really what I want to see from him. As a run defender, he's going to be kind of the same kind of run defender that he likely was with the Rams. Play to play might have some holes here or there, but capable of getting you some TFLs. That's really all I want from him there. It's really just the sack production that needs to tick up for him. So he needs to have, much like Mason Graham, right, where pressures aren't going to be enough for Mason Graham anymore, right? You're going to have to convert those pressures into sacks. You're probably going to need 12 out of Jared Verse. You're probably going to want more than 8 from Mason Graham, which is a lot from a defensive tackle. And 12 sacks, I know we're used to Miles' world, but 12 sacks is still a lot, right? We're used to being disappointed when Miles only gets like 16 sacks or something like that. But 12 is still a lot, right? 12 would put him in the top 5 of single seasons for Browns edge rushers ever. So that's the task for Jared Verse. Got to get 12 sacks. If you're Mason Graham, got to get 8. I think it's possible for the Browns to have more sacks as a team this year than they had last year, because if you look at last year's sack production, there's like Myles Garrett with 23, and then there's a bunch of other dudes underneath him with like 6 sacks, 4 sacks, 3 sacks, right? So the sack production as a team wasn't amazing last year. I think you can match it. I think you can even get higher than what you got last year. Will it be the same as the pressure that Miles puts on defense? No, but it will be comparable. And that's all we're really aiming for. If this defense can be comparable to what it was last year, then that's a win. That's a win for the Browns, because then you can add that first-round pick, add that second-round pick, add that third-round pick as time goes on, and you should theoretically be a better team than what you left off with. But that's the review for the defensive line room. It is a solid room. I would give it a B grade. It's not an A grade. I think, they need another heavy hitter to emerge, a young heavy. Like, it would be great if Isaiah McGuire could get 8 or 9 sacks, and that's somebody you have under a rookie contract, have under control for the next couple of years. If that could emerge, then that's what could help jump this to an A. If, Jared Verse can get more than 12 sacks, then that can help jump this to an A. If Mason Graham starts to get double-digit sacks, that could help it emerge to an A. There's upside and there's headroom for this defensive line room to get better than this B grade that I'm giving them right now as the season goes on. But right now, to start the year, I think B is a fair grade to give them. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.